India's benchmark stock index Nifty recovered from the recent low on hopes of a favorable trade deal with the US as a preferred trade partner and reliable ally. On April 9, 2025, as highly expected, the US President Trump blinked and postponed his reciprocal ad valorem tariffs of 10% to 40% on almost all countries, including India. The US will now apply a 10% universal basic tariff on almost all major countries, including India, till July 9, 2025, except China. For China, Trump imposed 145% tariffs, including 20% as punishment for the alleged supply of fentanyl synthetic opioid, while China also imposed 125% tariffs on U.S. goods. On April 11, 2025, Trump exempted various electronic items, including smartphones, computers, semiconductors, solar cells, flat-panel TV displays, flash drives, memory cards, and solid-state drives from Trump's reciprocal tariffs. But Trump will maintain a 20% fentanyl tariff on China on these electronic items. For India, Trump's discounted reciprocal tariff rate was 26% against alleged tariffs of 52% being imposed by India on American goods on average. This includes India's higher tariffs, GST, other levies, and various other regulatory, non-tariff trading barriers. Trump now wants to have free and fair access to India's huge market of consumer items and agricultural products, while India is not ready to allow that for various reasons, including a political protectionist stance. Like China, India is also not ready to negotiate with the megalomaniac Trump at gunpoint, but India is proactively preparing for the mid to long-term strategic trade negotiation with the US, keeping in mind the importance of the US as a reliable trade and diplomatic partner. Although India is not export-heavy economy like China, the US is India's #1 export destination, contributing almost a $56 billion trade surplus in goods and services. The US is also the third largest importer for India after China and the UAE, at around $67 billion in goods and services. The US is also a source of one of the highest remittances for India, around $32 billion. The US alone contributes almost 15% of total Indian exports and 20% of total Indian remittances. The US is India's third largest FDI source, around $68 billion from 2000 to 2024. The US also a big source of foreign portfolio investments into Indian capital market. On the other side, Indian MNCs like TCS, Infosys also invested around $40 billion in the US and created 400,000 jobs. In brief, the US is a vital source of India's USD requirement, which it needs to pay to China, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and even Russia for its imports of various consumer industrial goods, foods and fertilizers, and also fossil fuels. India is an import-oriented economy, and it imports almost 90% of its oil and energy requirements. Thus, although Trump's trade war tantrum may affect Indian GDP by 0.3% to 0.5%, it may affect indirectly much more, causing higher USD/INR and higher imported inflation. The US, seeking to rebalance its trade relationships, has imposed new tariffs on a wide range of goods. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, announced to address perceived trade imbalances and inequalities, impose a 26% import duty on Indian merchandise goods to America, which may be applicable from July 9, 2025, if negotiation fails. The U.S. Universal Basic Tariff of 10% is now applicable to all Indian merchandise goods except electronic items starting April 5, 2025. Trump's sectoral tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminum, automobiles and parts, and 20% secondary tariffs on Venezuelan oil are also applicable to India. Trump may also impose 15% to 25% tariffs on pharmaceuticals, a major source of Indian exports. India exports to the U.S. various consumer and industrial goods for around $42 billion. This includes engineering goods, automobile components, gems and jewelry like polished diamonds, generic pharmaceuticals, electronic goods like smartphones, telecom equipment, refined petroleum products, textiles and apparel including cotton garments. India also serves as a virtual back office and BPO of the U.S. and a major provider of U.S. tech outsourcing. India provides software and digital services, cloud computing, and AI solutions for big U.S. techs. At around $25 billion, the U.S. absorbs almost 60% of India's $40 billion IT service exports. India also exports over $10 billion worth of BPO, financial, telemedicine, and education services to the U.S. Many Indian professionals like doctors, engineers, and academics have settled in USA for a better standard of living and future. They are a major source of USD remittances into India. America's Silicon Valley is now virtually dominated by Indians. The U.S. exports to India various commodities, industrial, consumer, and agricultural goods like light sweet crude oil, LNG, diamonds, machinery, aircraft, and parts. In service export, the U.S. has a significant presence in banks and financials, travel and tourism, IP, business consulting, and aviation. Many Indian students aspire to do higher studies in the US for better opportunities and networking. In short, the stakes are high, as the US stands as India's largest export market and source of US dollars, the global reserve, and most preferred currency for cross-country transactions. The outcome of this trade negotiation will significantly impact India's economic trajectory. The potential disruption to existing trade flows is substantial. However, amidst these challenges lie opportunities for India to reshape its economic engagement with the US and the wider world. The coming months will be crucial in determining whether these two economic giants can find common ground. India's export basket to the US is diverse, ranging from intricately crafted jewelry to high-tech software solutions. This breadth of exports, while demonstrative of India's manufacturing prowess and service sector strength, renders it vulnerable to the sweeping nature of the new tariffs. The proposed tariffs target sectors that are central to India's export engine. Engineering goods, a significant contributor to India's export revenue, face the prospect of diminished competitiveness in the US market. Similarly, the pharmaceutical industry, a global supplier of affordable generics, could experience headwinds as tariffs drive up costs. The services sector, a cornerstone of India's economic growth, is not immune either. The potential disruption to the flow of IT services and financial back-office operations could have significant implications for India's burgeoning middle class. India's response to US tariff pressures has been marked by a calculated blend of pragmatism and assertiveness. While acknowledging the importance of maintaining a healthy trade and diplomatic relationship with the US, India has made it clear that it will not yield to pressure tactics. New Delhi's approach reflects a growing confidence in its economic standing on the world stage. India's negotiation strategy centers around securing a mutually beneficial trade deal. It has signaled a willingness to address some US concerns, including market access for certain goods and streamlining regulatory processes. However, India remains resolute in safeguarding its core interests, particularly in sectors deemed sensitive such as agriculture and MSMEs, where livelihoods of millions are at stake. This calibrated approach underscores India's commitment to protecting its domestic interests while striving for a mutually agreeable resolution. Potential reciprocal tariffs could hit Indian textiles and pharma, electronics, gems and jewelry, chemicals, textiles and auto parts face significant exposure due to high US demand. A 26% Trump tariff could reduce competitiveness and demand, with estimates suggesting a $33 billion drop in India's exports, resulting in 0.5% GDP contraction if applied at face value. A new cap on the US H-1B visa limit for Indian IT on-site delivery. Trump may also impose a digital tax on India's IT service exports. India is proactively addressing the tariffs through strategic measures and negotiations to secure a bilateral trade agreement, BTA, with the US, targeting completion of the first phase by late 2025. India and the US agreed in February 2025 to finalize the initial BTA phase by autumn, aiming for $500 billion in total trade by 2030 from current levels of around $190 billion. India-US negotiation focuses on market access, tariff reductions and technology transfers. India has offered to cut tariffs on $23 billion of U.S. imports, for example bourbon whiskey from 150% to 100%, Harley-Davidson motorcycles from 50% to 30%, Ethernet switches from 20% to 10%. India also plans to increase the procurement of U.S. defense equipment, aircraft oil, gas and medical devices. India also lowered tariffs on imported EVs and provided almost free satellite broadband entry to keep Musk and Trump in a good mood. India also reduced its weighted average tariff from 17% to 10.66% in the FY26 budget, enhancing export competitiveness. But India resists deep agricultural tariff cuts, for example 50% on apples, 42% on almonds, citing India's 300 million farmers, but is open to cutting tariffs on industrial and consumer goods. Resisting agri-tariff cuts may stall U.S. talks, as the U.S. demands open agriculture markets. The U.S. seeks greater market access for energy, LNG, crude oil, aerospace, aircraft, defense equipment, for example Boeing, F-35 talks. Agriculture, apples, almonds, soybeans, facing India's 3,100% tariffs. Electronics, semiconductors, chips, autos, EVs, components, for example Tesla. India aims to boost exports of pharmaceuticals and electronics, secure easier visa norms for IT professionals, H-1B restrictions are a hurdle. Protect politically sensitive sectors like agriculture and dairy from U.S. competition. India may liberalize e-commerce, data localization and retail sectors as concessions. In return, India may demand tariff exemptions or restoration of GSP, Generalized System of Preferences benefits. Trump's reciprocal tariffs could hurt Indian exports in the near term, as even a 10% universal basic tariff against the earlier 2.5% may affect U.S. discretionary consumer demand and Indian exports. Also, the high-potential synchronized global economic slowdown as a result of Trump's trade war bellicose tariff policies may affect the Indian economy directly and indirectly. India's counter-strategy will likely focus on trade deal negotiations, possibly offering selective concessions. India is leveraging the US-China duet. India may be playing on both sides. India knows that the US needs India in its never-ending Cold War strategy against China, while at the same time, India is also open to embracing China and BRICS to keep the US under pressure. A bilateral trade agreement could stabilize ties, but would require political will and economic compromises on both sides. The WTO logic allows developing nations like India to impose higher tariffs up to 48.5% on exports from developed nations like the US to protect industries and address economic gaps, as India defends for farmers and MSMEs. But Trump is unlikely to accept this logic outright, criticizing India's brutal tariffs as unfair and pushing reciprocity via 26% tariffs. Trump may force India to cut higher tariffs on various U.S. consumer goods, luxury items, and also industrial goods to at least 20%, along with free and fair access into India. Trump is now also eyeing the Indian consumer market, as India's middle class of around 300 million is equivalent to the whole U.S. Thus, India may eventually cut its tariffs to 20% universally on all imports or at least U.S. imports against U.S. universal minimum tariffs of 10%. Trump may also force India to cut exorbitantly high GST or sales tax to at least 15% on all U.S. goods. Trump will also keep sectoral tariffs on automobiles and parts at 25%, metals 25%, pharmaceuticals 15% to 25%, and electronics 15% to 25%, for national security and no dependency on a foreign adversary country like China, and also to make America great again. India is set to lose to some extent. India is trying to leverage China and Modi's friendship with Trump in trade talks with the US to get concessions, but it may not be so simple. India has to cut tariffs and GST in line with the Trump administration's preference. Lower tariffs may affect Indian producers in the short term, but may be good for the overall economy. India has to reset and reduce high tariffs and GST for its economic interest, not the US. Due to extremely high indirect taxes, the cost of living is very high in India compared to average earnings levels. Thus, Trump's tariff tantrum may be a blessing in disguise for India to undertake necessary policy reform to reduce tariffs and sales tax to reasonable global levels, allowing foreign producers to compete fairly with local Indian producers. India needs to come out of its decades-old protectionist policy, which is encouraging inefficiencies for domestic producers and the overall economy. Trump's existing tariffs of 10% on all U.S. imports, coupled with 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, almost 15% of total merchandise imports, and various sectoral tariffs of 20% to 25% on automobiles/parts, metals will effectively make overall weighted U.S. merchandise tariffs over 27.5% against earlier 2.5%. Contrary to Trump's narrative, these tariffs will be paid by U.S. importers, not Chinese or other exporters. Eventually, U.S. consumers have to bear these tariffs, which are nothing but import duties. This will inevitably cause a higher cost of living for Americans, higher inflation, subdued discretionary consumer spending, tepid private capex or business investment, and eventually stagflation or an all-out recession. Trump is trying to make America a big industrial hub solely on tariff threats. The U.S. lacks efficient industrial and logistical infrastructure, and thus, it may not be possible for America to compete with China in manufacturing, at least in the near term. The U.S. needs around $3 trillion worth of imported merchandise goods, almost 50% of its domestic demand. Trump is trying to use this huge U.S. merchandise consumption as leverage for a level playing field for U.S. exports. Trump is using his reciprocal tariffs as a hard negotiation strategy for a fair trade deal. Trump may eventually force 10%, 20% universal global tariffs by all developed and developing countries against a 10% universal U.S. tariff with no additional sectoral tariffs. Trump may also introduce a federal GST or VAT of 5%, 10% in line with other developed and developing countries for higher revenue and support deficit spending. Trump or the U.S. needs higher revenue for infrastructure capex to compete with mighty China, not through tariffs or trying to decouple China. The U.S. and China are dependent on each other for prosperity and development. The U.S. also needs Chinese market access as China is now the world's second largest economy. Thus, U.S. and China may soon reconcile rather than engaging in a protracted trade and Cold War, in which there is no clear winner. China has much lower tariffs and local sales taxes than India, along with lower non-tariff barriers due to the overall efficacy of its production system. Thus, India has to reset and reform itself to be competitive with China. Various countries like Vietnam, Mexico, Japan, and the EU are now offering Trump 10% or even 0% tariffs in exchange for similar tariffs from the US. India has to compete with these countries to keep its share of US merchandise exports and trade surplus. Trump will not wait for another 5 to 25 years for lower Indian tariffs, sales taxes, and deregulations. India has to act now. Will it be possible? Only time will tell.